Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going to be going over a tutorial I really should have done a long time ago because I've been asked a ton of times for it, and it's actually caused a lot of confusion and caused people to actually kind of get locked out of their NASs in some cases. And so we're going to go over how to set this up and get it right so you're good. And that is going to be how to use the firewall on your Synology NAS. And so before we even get started on this, I need to give one disclaimer. The majority of users actually don't even need to set up a firewall. You do not need to set up a firewall on your Synology NAS. That's because in most people's home networking and even most businesses networking, your firewall should be your actual router. And so having the Synology also have a firewall is a nice to have, but is not strictly necessary, though especially if you have a cheap consumer router, the Synology has a much better ability to kind of customize the exact rules and who's able to access what. And so in that case, it can be very useful. And so this tutorial is going to be basically starting off by what is a firewall and how does it work, and then going on to the basic firewall rules that I would set up for most people and how to set up pretty easily so you're also not going to be locking yourself out. So first off, what is a firewall? A firewall in networking is essentially a block. All connections have to go through the firewall before actually getting done on the end. So say you have an SMB server. That is where you can easily hook up your Synology and see it via macOS Finder or Windows File Explorer. That packet goes over port 445. So that connection goes over port 445. So whenever your computer goes and clicks connect to the Synology via macOS Finder, it is going to send a request on port 445 to the Synology says, hey, I want to connect to you. But before we get to any of the internal packages of the Synology, first it's got to pass through the firewall. And that firewall is going to go through a list of rules that it's got, a list of rules that we're going to set up. And it's going to look at every single one of these rules, and I'll explain it more once we've actually got it set up. And it is going to find the first one that matches. And whatever the first one matches is, it is going to listen to that, either block or allow. And that is how a firewall works. It allows you to say what can and cannot connect into the network. And so Synology's firewall is a package that most Linux administrators and anybody who's really ever followed a tutorial online on how to set something up online for a service on like an AWS instance or DigitalOcean probably already be familiar with. And that is UFW, or uncomplicated firewall. It's very easy to set up, and it's even easier through Control Panel where you can really see it all out. And I will say, there is one difference between the firewall on Synology and what you would find on a higher end router that really has an advanced firewall. And that is that the Synology is always allowed to receive packets that it has requested. And that is a good thing because it makes it a lot simpler, but that is just one difference. And that is how the vast majority of people probably want to do it anyway. The one thing you cannot do with this firewall is specifically block internet access to certain things. And so you can't do things like block all web access from the Synology. You can't do that kind of thing. That's not what this setup is even really able to do. I'm sure you could SSH in and figure it out, but that is not how this is designed. And that's a good thing. And so to explain this for people who don't know a ton about firewalls, it's pretty simple. And we're going to talk about it just on my computer, it's easier to explain like that. And so say on my computer, I had a firewall rule that said, I never want to have any incoming traffic on port 80, no matter what. So if I had a firewall rule that did that, and I went to Google, I would be able to have outgoing traffic. So I'd be able to send a request to www.google.com on port 80, which is the web HTTP port. Then Google is going to send me acknowledgement, some packet, whatever the website is, it's going to return that. But if I had a firewall that did not allow return traffic, my computer would say, nope, even though I requested that, I'm not allowed to have any traffic on port 80 and block it. That's not what you want. Instead, what the vast majority of firewalls do, and your Synology does as well by default, is it allows established traffic. So that is exactly what you want, because you want to be able to say, okay, I don't want anybody coming in on port 80, but if I go out to port 80, I want to be able to get that back. And so that's really what the firewall is doing. It's keeping this massive list of all these different packets that it has sent out. And every packet that comes back in, it checks it against that list. If it's in reference to one of the packets that has already gone out, so it's basically a reply from a web server you've reached out to, it's going to say, great, you are fine. And if it's not, it's going to go into the other rules. I just wanted to explain that really quickly because it's a little bit more advanced and it helps people kind of understand how firewalls work. But that is really out of the scope of this because this is a very simple firewall to set up, and we're going to be going over the basics here. All right, so now let's go over how to actually set up a firewall on a Synology NAS. And it's very easy. And I'm in DSM 7.2 beta, which is pretty much the same, except now Quick Connect listens to firewall rules. So in previous versions of DSM, Quick Connect actually kind of bypassed those firewall rules and was always allowed in. Now you can actually use firewall rules with Quick Connect, which is great. So to set up a firewall, you just go into Control Panel, Security, and Firewall. And now what a lot of people will do is they will hit Enable Firewall, and they're like, great, my firewall's enabled. This has done absolutely nothing. That's because the default profile is blank. And so the way that the default firewall works right out of the box on Synology is it says, okay, there's nothing in here. And so then if we look down here, this is the All Interfaces tab. So when we say, if no rules in all interfaces are matched, rules in each interface will be matched. Okay, so no rules were matched over here. So now we need to go into the specific interface. And for me, that'd be coming in on LAN 3. Well, there's nothing coming in on LAN 3. There's no firewall rules on LAN 3. All right, nothing's been matched. Allow access. So by default, this is allowing all access in, the exact same thing as if you had no firewall whatsoever. But what we're going to want to do is we're really going to set up everything in the All Interfaces tab. If you have a special VLAN over here, so say you have a specific security camera VLAN, and you only want traffic on that security camera VLAN coming in via the specific ports and they can't access anything else, you could actually create rules on these specific LANs over here and set them up like that. Or you could always do it based off of subnets. But instead, we're going to keep it easy here, and we're just going to do everything on all interfaces, and you can manage all those rules on all interfaces just based off of subnets. We can actually leave the profile name as default, and let's actually set up a real firewall. So a real firewall, the last rule you should have is block everything. Because normally what you want to be able to do on a firewall is you want to say, first, I want to allow a bunch of stuff, and then anything that has not been explicitly allowed, I want to block. And that is generally how you'll see a setup. Now, this is one place where you can lock yourself out of your network, and you may have to do a soft reset. A soft reset resets the firewall rules. So if you ever do accidentally lock yourself out, you can do that. But I'm going to create some rules here that are going to make sure you never lock yourself out and don't disrupt any local services. So the firewall I'm going to set up here is really going to be designed to block external access on specific ports. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to set it up where anything on the local networks is allowed in, anything not on the local networks is blocked. And that is a great place to start because you want everybody on your local network to have access to all the services on the NAS. And you should be really controlling that by, if you don't want somebody to be able to do something on the local network at all, you probably should just block the service entirely. Now, if you are a little bit more advanced and you do have a bunch of network setup and you know your stuff, you can really customize this down to exactly what people can and cannot do. But this is just going to be a great place for people to start that is not going to get in your way. That's really the goal of this, is to not get in your way, because everything on the Synologies really has authentication on it anyway. And so you don't need to worry too much about this. This is really just additive security. And so I'm going to set this up where the 3 RFC 1918 networks, those are your local networks. There's the 10.anything, the 192.168.anything, the 172.16.anything. Those 3 networks, I'm going to set up here where essentially they are allowed in. And so your router should be giving out IP addresses on one of those 3 addresses anyway. And those 3 addresses do not route on the internet. So you know that those connections had to have come from in the network or come from a VPN that's into the network. But that's the only place that those could have come because they cannot be routed just on the internet. And so we're going to go ahead and set those up, and we're going to set them up with allow. So we're going to hit create. We're going to allow all ports. And for our specific IP address, we're first going to do the 10.anything subnet. So it's 10.0.0.0 with a subnet mask of 255.0.0.0. So for people who are not super familiar with networking, this is one of those private networks. And essentially the subnet mask means that any digit after the 10 can be varied and it's all on the network. I'm planning on doing a full explanation of IP subnets and everything like that, but anybody will be able to enter these 3 rules in and start working. And we're going to select that and hit allow. I'm going to repeat for the next two rules for the other two RFC 1918s. The next one's going to be 192.168.0.0, and it's going to be 255.255.0.0. And allow again. Now the last one I'm always going to have to look up because I never remember what this /12 is. And it is this guy right here. 255.240. Subnet masks are complicated. They're a lot easier when they just end in 255 or 0. So I tend to stick to those networks. But the 172.16 has always gotten me because of that. So we're just going to add that in here. Okay. So right here, these are the first three rules you should have. If you know more about networking and you know what your specific subnet is, you can specifically add just yours or anything like that. But anybody without any knowledge of networking should be able to add these three rules and be safe and say that your local network should be on one of these three or you got bigger problems. Now, all we've done is add allows. So as we said earlier, because we've not had a block anywhere there, it's just going to allow everything. What we want to do now is we want to have a catch-all block. And this is one where you can start actually locking out services, and so you may run into things no longer happening specifically on the internet. Because we've got these three rules up here, you know everything will route locally, so all of your local connections will work, but remote connections will not once we add this rule, just letting you know. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say all ports, all IP addresses, deny. And so now the way this reads is, we are going to go down from the top. You always start with firewall rules to the top, and you stop whenever one of them matches. So anytime I've got a local connection coming in, so my subnet is on 10.30.0.0, which is within 10.0.0.0255, that guy right there, is going to be allowed. So any of my local connections will be allowed on any ports and any protocols. But now say I'm on my phone outside and my IP address is 132.45, whatever. It is going to look down through these first three rules and say, hey, that's not contained in any of those. Well, the fourth one says anything, deny. And so now any connections outside of your home's network, even if you have port 40 enabled, will be blocked. One thing I would highly recommend doing is before ever hitting apply, always look at these rules right here. You can drag them, and so you want to make sure that the deny is always at the bottom and that these three rules are always at the top unless you know what you're doing and you know what your subnet is. So now we can hit OK and hit apply. Now we have zero remote access to this device. But let's say we want to be able to access something on this. That is totally normal. We want to be able to access something outside of our home's network. Well, let's say we want to be able to access DSM and Synology Drive Share Sync. Two easy ports to add in there. But we know we're never going to be accessing it outside the country, so we're only going to do it for the United States. We can go ahead and add that in here. So we're just going to say create new firewall rule. And this is where we're going to start selecting our specific applications because we don't want to open up something like SMB of the United States unnecessarily. And so, by the way, this in and of itself is not going to make that happen. You still need to open up the ports on your router. But here we can go ahead and select our list of built-in applications. And we're going to do the two DSM ones right here, 5000, 5001. And if you change those, it will also be changed there. And we're also going to scroll down to port 6690 for Synology Drive server. So there we go. We have set all of these guys on up. And now we can say, hey, the applications I want to be able to access, all of those are really designed to be on the internet, so they should be safe. But just in case, let's also limit the source IP to only the United States. So that is using location, and we can just search on in. And you can select which parts you like. If it's just mainland United States, and like, I guess the States, you can choose that. Now note, these are not perfect. Obviously an attacker could VPN in, and so some of these rules may be blocked by VPN carriers. So it's not perfect. This should not be your sole security, But it's nice to start with something like this because the more restrictive you are with all of your rules, generally the safer you'll be. And so now we've said, okay, we're going to allow DSM as well as Synology Drive Server. And these can be any applications you care about. You can also add in your WebDAV. Anything you really are using, wanting to use, you can select. Then your location, you can be as restrictive or non-restrictive as possible. You generally want to set up it as allow rather than block. You can only select, I think, 30 countries because there is a performance implication on this. And then we're going to say allow. Now, by default, it has added it to the bottom of the list, which means it's useless. That rule, any rules below this, all deny, are never going to hit because they're going to get stopped by this. So now we want to drag it up. We're actually going to want to drag it up to below the 3 allow rules right here due to performance reasons. There are a lot of possible IP addresses within the United States. And so there is a slight overhead that every single packet has to take. And so by having it below these 3, will actually give you overall better performance because the majority of connections you're going to have are on the local network, which are way faster to look up than looking up these. It's ancillary, but can have a legitimate performance impact, especially if you start having more and more complicated rules. And so now with this firewall rule, if we have those ports open on our router, our NAS is going to start accepting packets from those ports from IP addresses that match the United States of America. And now we can hit OK. And so that right there is probably the easiest setup I would have for people. I will also highly recommend disabling firewall notifications. I would just disable that because it's really annoying and you should be manually adding in your firewall rules because you know what it is, especially with our setup here where we've allowed local access through the firewall. And so that way you really don't have to worry about it. And so you really should be very cautious and think about, okay, I now want somebody to be able to access this outside of my local network. Let's go ahead and do steps to have this. Now, if somebody comes in via VPN server, that is not going to be the case. They're actually going to get a local IP address. And so it's going to circumvent these rules. Another thing I did want to mention before closing out this video, 1, Docker loves to break these rules. Docker has a special networking that kind of like circumvents these rules. And so you will find times where even if you've got it set up on the firewall over here, Docker may say, nah, I'm going to take that. So Docker is allowed to break these rules in some cases. So just be wary of that. Don't think just because you've set it up on here means you're golden. You should double check that for every single Docker container you expose because Docker actually gets to circumvent UFW sometimes. There's a few subs you can do for that. I'm not going to go into it, but just be wary of that. And then 2, I want to talk about the fact that your router is actually doing this for you the entire time. It is always checking in and only allowing packets in that you have allowed in by default. So port forwarding is essentially you telling your router, hey, allow this through the firewall and specifically to the actual address. Very expensive routers that are very advanced actually require you to do both. They require you to not only set up port forwarding, but also set up on the firewall. Those are really annoying because, well, they should at least make a default rule, but technically on very advanced firewalls, you have to do both because port forwarding just says whenever you get a packet, send it here. Whereas the firewall may block it as well. And so for the most part, you probably don't need to do this, but you may have a router that does universal plug and play, or you accidentally open up something that you didn't really intend. And so that's where this can be really nice because this forces you to understand what you're opening up. Another thing is very few routers actually allow you to geo-block like this and actually select what services are allowed from what IP addresses. And so that can be very nice to do as well. And so having the firewall is always a good setup, especially the way we've set it up here, where we are very specific about what is allowed in and what is allowed out. And by having all of the local networks allowed in by default means you're not going to get a headache on, hey, this is not working, why is this not working? But one thing I will close out this video on, always, always, always be cautious before saying, okay, because you can lock yourself out of your NAS. It's not where you have to format the thing, but you can lock yourself out of the NAS and have to do a soft reset on it, which can mess up some of your configurations and things like that. So always before you hit apply, check it. You will also get a notification that, hey, this might lock you out sometimes. But generally, always just be cautious before hitting okay, because I've done it before when tinkering around and had to do a soft reset because I was running through it and just messing around and it has happened before. Alright, well that's going to be it for this tutorial. Go and leave any other tutorials you'd like to see me make in the comments below. And if you want to hire me for a project, I've got a link for that down in the description below. Alright, have a good one. Bye!